Something disturbing is happening in shopping aisles across the country, and it's getting worse every single day. Retail workers, many of them teenagers just starting their careers, are facing an unprecedented wave of verbal attacks, physical threats, and outright violence that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. But here's where it gets controversial. Experts believe our collective response to the COVID pandemic may have fundamentally rewired how we treat each other in public spaces. Scott Harris knows this harsh reality better than most. After dedicating 26 years of his life to the Queensland Police Force, he made a career pivot that tells its own story about the state of our society. Harris now runs a specialized consultancy that teaches retail employees how to diffuse hostile situations and manage aggressive customers. The fact that his business is absolutely thriving should alarm every single one of us. The escalation has been unmistakable during the decade I've been operating this business, Harris explains. Much of this surge coincided with the COVID era, when people endured prolonged isolation and lockdowns. We've witnessed an erosion of basic respect, empathy, and human decency toward those working in retail environments. Harris isn't just sharing casual observations. He's training teams at Australia's biggest retail giants, including Woolworths, Coles, Bunnings, and KFC. These companies wouldn't be investing heavily in conflict management training unless the problem was both serious and widespread. And this is the part most people miss. The numbers behind this crisis are genuinely shocking. Just last week, Woolworths disclosed a staggering 26% surge in violent incidents across their store network over the past 12 months. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about a quarter more violent episodes in spaces where families shop for groceries and daily necessities. The situation became so severe that Woolworths was forced to implement complete store lockdowns 45 times during just the first 6 months of this year due to security emergencies. The supermarket chain has responded by dramatically enhancing their security infrastructure, with additional protective measures still in development. But the fact that such extreme steps are necessary reveals how far we've fallen as a society. Official crime data paints an equally troubling picture. New South Wales recorded a 4.3% increase in retail theft incidents in the year leading up to March, while Victoria experienced a dramatic 40% spike during the same time frame. Victoria faces particular challenges with organized criminal networks that systematically steal merchandise for black market resale. But the broader issue extends far beyond professional theft rings. Here's what should really concern us. Ordinary people without criminal backgrounds are increasingly likely to become hostile, abusive, or violent toward shop workers and service counter staff. The Australian Retailers Association has documented that an overwhelming 87% of retail employees report experiencing verbal abuse during their work, while 51% have endured physical abuse or threats. But here's where it gets controversial. Who exactly is bearing the brunt of this aggression? The statistics reveal something deeply troubling about the targets of this behavior. The retail workforce is predominantly composed of women and young people. More than half are female, and over 1/3 fall between the ages of 15 and 24, according to Australian Retailers Association data. We're essentially talking about a pattern where adults are increasingly taking out their frustrations on some of society's most vulnerable workers. The severity of this crisis prompted the Australian Retailers Association and National Retail Association to jointly organize a retail crime symposium in Melbourne this past July, bringing together industry leaders, security experts, and researchers to address what many now consider a national emergency. Among the keynote speakers was Associate Professor Xanthi Mallet, a criminologist from Central Queensland University, who has been studying the psychological aftermath of the pandemic. Her research suggests we're witnessing a fundamental shift in our collective mental state that extends far beyond retail environments. There's been a comprehensive transformation in our national psychology following COVID, with young people particularly struggling to readjust to normal social interactions, Mallet explains. One of the most visible symptoms of this shift is the increase in rude, disrespectful, and aggressive behavior in public settings. And this is the part most people miss. The problem isn't confined to retail workers. Anecdotal reports from healthcare professionals, emergency responders, educators, and even local government employees suggest this pattern of increased aggression is affecting all public-facing service workers. The situation has become so pervasive that even automated phone systems now include polite reminders about zero-tolerance policies for staff mistreatment, a precaution that would have seemed absurd just a few years ago. Mallett's analysis goes deeper into the psychological mechanisms at play. People have become more defensive and self-protective in their daily interactions, she observes. We've experienced a significant breakdown in social connections and community bonds, particularly because the pandemic literally made people fearful of their neighbors and fellow community members. Recovery from that level of social trauma takes considerable time. But here's where it gets controversial. Mallett draws connections between this social deterioration and the rise of extremist movements. She specifically points to the growth of the sovereign citizen movement, a concerning blend of anti-government conspiracy theories, extreme individualism, anti-authoritarian sentiment, and various far-right ideological elements, as another manifestation of the same post-COVID social breakdown. The pandemic lockdowns had profound effects on our collective mental health and social functioning, Mallett argues. These restrictions triggered paranoid thinking patterns in certain segments of the population that persist today. While the majority of people successfully readjusted to normal social interactions, specific groups continue struggling with the psychological aftermath. Young people and children appear particularly vulnerable to these ongoing effects, which raises serious questions about the long-term social consequences of our pandemic response strategies. Of course, isolating COVID's specific impact proves challenging given the simultaneous influence of smartphone addiction and the now documented harmful effects of social media platforms on youth mental health. However, the evidence strongly suggests we're still wrestling with both the social disruption caused by the pandemic and the psychological trauma inflicted by extended lockdown periods. Interestingly, the entertainment industry is beginning to explore these themes. American director Ari Aster recently released Eddington, one of the first major films to examine the unique psychological chaos that the global health crisis unleashed on individuals and entire communities. Set during May 2020, the movie portrays how a small New Mexico town navigates the early pandemic period. While the surface narrative focuses on conflict between a conservative sheriff, Joaquin Phoenix, and liberal mayor, Pedro Pascal, over mask mandate enforcement, the film's true subject is the gradual onset of psychological breakdown and radicalization affecting every town resident in distinctly personal ways. Aster explained to the New York Times that he aimed to capture the experience of existing in a reality where nobody can agree on basic facts about what's actually happening. COVID represented a turning point where our connection to the society we once knew was permanently severed. This disconnection from established social norms feels particularly acute in the American context, where the Centers for Disease Control director was recently dismissed by President Trump, apparently for maintaining scientific standards within her organization. However, the internet-driven isolation, accelerated by pandemic restrictions, extends well beyond American borders. Aster describes his film as fundamentally exploring what happens when isolated individuals lose their ability to perceive the broader world beyond their personal experiences. In such circumstances, he warns, we begin reinforcing each other's paranoia and fear because the social fabric that once held communities together has disintegrated. Author Patricia Lockwood is addressing similar themes in her upcoming pandemic novel, Will There Ever Be Another You?, which follows a narrator's psychological deterioration after contracting COVID. As one New York Times reviewer noted, many readers may have suppressed or deliberately forgotten the intense psychological strain of living through the pandemic period. Here's a personal perspective that might surprise you. During my own teenage years, working checkout shifts at Woolworths, I certainly encountered condescending customers, but never experienced the verbal abuse or degrading treatment that seems commonplace today. Retail positions frequently serve as first jobs for teenagers and young adults, providing invaluable real-world experience that addresses many issues we often criticize in today's youth: elevated anxiety levels and apparent lack of resilience when facing ordinary life challenges. It would represent a tragic irony if escalating aggression rates discouraged young people from pursuing this type of formative work experience. Working a teenage retail job demands personal organization, self-responsibility, and accountability to supervisors and institutions that maintain much higher expectations than sympathetic parents typically do. These positions require close interaction with diverse groups of people and the development of interpersonal skills necessary for getting along with colleagues and customers. These represent precisely the kind of pro-social values and experiences we desperately need to rebuild social cohesion, regardless of what originally caused its deterioration. But here's the question that should make us all uncomfortable. Are we willing to admit that our pandemic response strategies may have created lasting psychological damage that's now being inflicted on the most vulnerable members of our workforce? And more importantly, what are we going to do about it? The retail workers facing daily abuse didn't choose to become the outlet for our collective post-pandemic trauma, yet they're paying the price for societal changes they had no role in creating. Is this the kind of community we want to build as we move forward? What's your take on this? Have you noticed increased aggression in retail settings? Or do you think this is just media sensationalism? Share your experiences and thoughts, whether you agree or disagree with the COVID connection theory.